in terms of like the setting itself, it's just I've always been fascinated with this place. And I remember visiting El Salto del Tequendama, which is like the place where the hotel is and where the story takes place for the most part. And I remember seeing it for the first time, like in real life, and thinking, oh my God, like how can a place this beautiful and so stunning be also like a place where people think bad things happen? Like, how can it be, beautiful and haunting at the same time? Because there are like a lot of stories that you hear from locals, and like there's history of like things, people getting murdered, people killing themselves. Like, how can a place this beautiful be also the carrier of such sad and tragic stories? I remember that was like the feeling and the thing that kept me like going back to the place, was like, how can it be so beautiful, but also so haunting and so scary in many ways? So when I decided to write a horror novel, I knew that was where I wanted the book to take place in, because it had stuck, this feeling had stuck with me for such a long time, for almost like 8 or 7 years, which was like I first visited a place in 2016, I think, and I started writing this book at the end of 2021. So I knew immediately like I wanted to use that setting. And then the story sort of like came from me like wanting to set the book in this place. And it sort of like emerged from there, the story and the characters. Um, and then like when it comes to like the historical setting and what life was for a woman in Colombia back then in the 20s and in the mid 30s, I think it wasn't much different from what like any other women's lives in any other place was. Um, it's for me like it's sort of like what was happening back then, not just with women, but as a whole. Like it was a time where the world was changing, and we had just come out of like the First World War, and we were also like entering the Great Depression. And then with the Second World War, a lot of things were changing, and for better or for worse. And sort of like women were in the middle of it, where there was promises of like change, of like the world sort of like changing for the better for us as women. But a lot of those promises weren't really being kept, because, we were fighting for land, and countries were invading each other, and people were getting killed off, and women were sort of like in the middle of it, because suddenly their husbands had to leave for war. And they were left alone, taking care of their kids or their family members. So that was sort of like one of the reasons why I wanted to set the book in this specific time period. And it was also because, like, while I was doing research, I found that the hotel was first built in 1923. That was when the house was built. And then later on, it was turned into a hotel. So I sort of like drew from real life things and sort of like created like my own world and my own like characters from it, from me wanting to like, set it in this specific location. And then with everything that was happening at that time, not only in Colombia, but in the world, sort of like, again, my characters and the whole story emerged from it. Antonia is, again, a woman who's sort of like trying to navigate life in a very, in a country where, Catholicism is huge even now. I don't think specifically in the Colombian context or in Latin America even that things have changed much for women. I mean, of course we're allowed to work and we can vote, but I think that some of these things that were a thing 100 years ago still linger, and they are like there's this like undercurrent of what a woman can be or cannot be, even if we think with like um become better as a society. I think that some of those things still linger. So Antonia is a woman who, you know, is born with certain type of like privilege. She comes from a rich family. His dad is a famous architect in Colombia who also like built this stunning place, unlike anything Colombia had ever seen. And then his mother is also a woman who is trying to sort of like gain some sort of power. And in doing that, she sort of like abandons Antonia in many ways. So Antonia sort of like has to grow up and like fend for herself because his mother is like obsessed with this culture, this musical culture, and she's trying to like do her own thing. And then her dad is sort of like only paying attention to what his wife wants. So Antonia sort of like grows up um, in a very dysfunctional family. And then, of course, her mother dies. And she's left with, you know, her dad who's depressed. Sort of, yeah, I mean, he's haunted by his grief, I guess. And she has to care for him. And now there's this like wild things happening in the house where she grew up. And the house may or may not be haunted, but Antonia sort of like doesn't really want to let herself believe that it is. So yeah, I think she's I mean, I love her, but I know I put her through a lot. Because she's sort of like trying to keep what's left of her family together, while sacrificing what she actually wants, which is like freedom and which is like do her own thing. So she ends up like having to work with the nuns, even though she doesn't really believe in God. And then she has to like sort of like try to save her dad from prison. So she ends up like having to do all of these things that she doesn't really want to do, and losing even more control over, you know, her life and herself in the process. So like it's a lot of the book, it's her like trying to regain that power and trying to again live as a woman in this society that is like trying to control her when it comes to like even from every angle, so to speak.